got a good program for you this morning. I'm going to start out talking a little bit about our year in review, what we've been up to over the past 12 months or so, both from kind of a planning perspective as well as some of the initiatives that the staff has been spearheading, and I think they dovetail very well with the theme of regional collaboration, cooperation, and shared services, which you'll hear more about in about 40 minutes here. And next on the agenda after me, we will have Randy Cole from the Office of Budget Management to give a presentation from the state's perspective on some of the initiatives that he and his office have been spearheading. After that, Randy graciously agreed to moderate a panel discussion for us with some of our local government members and with ODOT to discuss some of the things that are going on in the region. After that, it's lunchtime, which is probably my favorite part of the event, and then we'll have Mayor Robart to make some closing remarks. So one thing I wanted to mention, housekeeping from an AMATS perspective, which is pretty important, is we have solicitations out right now for our funding program for all of you to apply for federal funds through the agency. Letters of intent are due Friday, October 18th, so 1 week from today. If you have any projects that you even think you might want to apply for, I definitely recommend you send us a letter of intent. There's no harm if you decide not to go through with the application, but basically those letters give us a good idea of what you're thinking about doing, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say the staff is always here, honestly, from the bottom of our hearts to help you with those. So we are more than happy to help you hone your application and try to put the best application together. With that, the theme of what I was going to talk about is, you guys have all heard the phrase probably, think globally, act locally. I wanted to talk about think regionally, act locally, because I think what we're learning from our staff's perspective as we continue to do this work and hopefully get a little bit better at it every year is, we're here kind of to look at the region holistically, but we also realize where things actually happen are at the local level, and we really have been trying to make an effort to engage more with local governments and to help you out, and you in turn help us out a lot. So I'm going to cover some of that as well. Three main things I wanted to discuss. The first was kind of talk about, just to set the stage from a transportation standpoint, was some of the transportation issues that are current right now and how those are reflected as priorities in our regional transportation plan, which we approved earlier this year. I wanted to talk after that a little bit about how we've been working on developing a better culture of innovation and collaboration within the agency, and then I was going to wrap up with talking about some of the planning initiatives that we've been working on. I think almost everybody here knows who AMATS is, but in case you don't, we are the Metropolitan planning organization that covers Greater Akron. We serve all of Summit and Portage counties and about 1/8 of the northeastern corner of Wayne County, which is basically the city of Rittman and the village of Doylestown. Our responsibilities are basically four things that we do. We develop a regional transportation plan, which I'll talk about in a second. Overseeing the expenditure of federal transportation funds. So when federal transportation funds come into the area, our policy committee decides how those funds should be spent, approves that funding. We also receive a direct allocation of federal funding for projects as well that the policy committee oversees. One of our big jobs, which I think is part of the theme of the meeting today, is coordinating transportation improvements with federal officials, state officials, and local officials, which we'll talk about quite a bit today. And then the final thing is serving as a forum for all of you as local governments and elected officials to come together and talk about transportation policy and improvements in the area. I think when we developed our plan over the last couple of years, and as I mentioned, it was approved in May of this year, we kind of rethought a lot of the ways that we were doing things transportation policy-wise. And one thing that we really felt like, given some of the economic and demographic trends, which I'll talk a little bit about, is starting to focus more on maintaining the existing transportation system. our agency, I think, historically has always spent a lot of time working with reducing traffic congestion. It's not that that's not something we think about at all anymore, but I think just given some of the trends that we've been experiencing in the state and the region, Ohio is the 46th fastest growing state in the nation, which I regret to report. The state only added 7,700 residents since the year 2010. And well, in a way that's bad news, I think, from a planning perspective, and with all the fiscal difficulties that we've had, the one silver lining of that number, I think, is that we have the luxury a little bit in this region, in this state, to be able to step back and not have to just pay a lot of money, basically, to accommodate growth. If you look at Metropolitan Atlanta, I think Atlanta gained 200,000 residents since 2010. So it's pretty amazing, or I'm sorry, since the year 2000. So just the level of growth in some areas is a lot higher than ours. Ohio, we're blessed with a very good transportation infrastructure, but it's been with us for a while. So our plan does focus more on what will it take to maintain that. And I think also just from a perspective of growth in the region, trying to focus more on the maintenance of the existing system and less on, you know, some of the projects which may open up more land for development, and then we get into issues of having to accommodate more growth while other areas decline. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the priorities of our regional transportation plan, they're basically four big ones: maintaining existing roads and bridges, which we use the term "fix it first" for that. Improving safety continues to be a big focus. I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later. Strategically investing in where are the high crash locations, and the staff, along with ODOT and with the Ohio Department of Public Safety, I think has done a great job of having good data, which really originally comes from all the law enforcement agencies that all of you oversee at the local level. We have tried to promote more and support alternatives to driving. I think we realize that, you know, this isn't something that most of the population is going to do. We fully believe people are going to continue to drive most places, but being able to invest in public transit, biking and walking, and make it easier for the people to choose to do that is one of our big priorities. And then finally, working with local communities on land use and urban design decisions that make it easier and not harder for people that either can't drive or choose not to drive. And I'll talk about that a little bit when I cover our Connecting Communities initiative. So basically, like I said before, our plan focuses on building new highway capacity sparingly. We do have some projects that go through ODOT's track process that are on the plan to do that, but I think it's fair to say, compared to the 1990s when this region was growing a little bit faster, that's taken a little bit more of a back seat. I think one thing that I always think about a lot is how the world really is changing. I think especially the economic crash of 2008 and the recession that followed after that, there are a lot of fiscal and demographic trends that I think are changing the world in pretty fundamental ways. One big issue for a metropolitan planning organization or for ODOT is that the Highway Trust Fund at the federal level is basically insolvent. It's not in the sense that it does continue to fund transportation projects, but the federal gas tax hasn't kept up with the level of revenue that's being expended. So Congress every year appropriates money from the general fund into that Highway Trust Fund. And it's fair to say, I think over the next couple years, that's probably something that just fiscally can't continue to happen. And Congress right now is kind of wrestling with, are they going to raise the gas tax? Are they going to create some sort of vehicle miles traveled tax? Is it going to be less funding? Those are all issues that are being discussed right now. I definitely don't have to tell any of you. You live the reality every day with declining revenues and stagnant revenues at the state and local level. And I think when we put our plan together, what that tells us is we just have to do a better job with the resources that we have. And while it would be nice to have additional funding for transportation, whether it's existing funding levels or even more, it's equally important to spend that money wisely. One thing the plan also promotes is investing more in public transportation. The state of Ohio ranks 7th in population. We're 12th in public transit ridership. We're 47th in state support for public transportation. Now, it is true most public transportation support comes from the local and the federal level, but I think transit agencies in Ohio really have been struggling to try to keep up with the constituency they serve. And I always look at public transit on two levels. On the first level, it is essentially a social service. It is there for people that either are not affluent enough to own a car or are disabled or choose not to drive a car. That's about 8% of the population of our state's households that don't have a vehicle. It is a higher percentage in the larger cities. But then I think a secondary issue too is within the fiscal constraints, at least trying to grow public transit as an alternative for people that do own vehicles that may choose not to drive. So I think we do need to do a better job of funding and planning for public transit, based on the equity issues that I was mentioning. Another thing the plan looks at is this issue of adding new highway capacity and taking a second look at is it enough for economic development simply to expand the transportation infrastructure? And while I think there are definitely individual cases where that still makes sense, I think as an overall economic development framework, I would argue we've got a very large interstate system in the state of Ohio. We have a pretty dense network of roads, and we have a lot of land, especially that we have previously developed in urban areas that is underutilized. And I think from our plans perspective, we start to discuss is really building more infrastructure. Is that the key to economic growth? Or are there other factors there? And I think one thing that we're trying to promote, again, through our Connecting Communities program is the idea of placemaking. And if we create better places in the communities that are already established, and that includes every community in our region, it's just a matter of being a little bit more conscious of how land is developed. And I think overall, when you see some of the interest, just a quick example, in Richfield, when we did the Connecting Communities project there, we engaged with and talked a lot to the people at the Kinross Office Park, which those of you that are familiar off of Wheatley Road, and a lot of the the employees and the folks from the corporations were talking about how it would be nice to have more of a town center to be able to walk to, or businesses and so forth. And that's a complicated issue. It's not like you can just, especially at the local government level, snap your finger and create businesses. But I think it did just start to tell us that there are amenities as far as how things are developed and what an area looks and feels like that I think over the long haul are more attractive for attracting businesses as well as residents. So I think moving forward with our transportation plan, as I mentioned before, recognizing some of the demographic changes. Again, the lower population growth and the declining vehicle miles traveled. I mean, you can look at those trends as negatives, and sure, I love this state. I would love to see more people come here and enjoy what we do. But again, I think it is an opportunity at least to kind of reflect on how we plan things and develop. And when the growth comes in the future, and it probably will because these things go in cycles, I think it prepares us to be ready for it more. So I kind of already covered what the priorities of the plan are in those last bullets. I'll go ahead and move on. So where is AMATS heading? One thing I wanted to talk about here was just how we're trying to kind of shape the culture of our organization to be more effective and really to serve all of you better. And the four big takeaways, I think, from this is we are really serious about trying to learn by doing. And, the only thing I think worse than having a bad experience is having a bad experience that you don't learn from. So as we do our planning, hopefully we don't have a lot of bad experiences, but as we do our work with all of you, we're constantly trying to learn and to improve it and make it better. I mentioned earlier about thinking regionally and acting locally. Some of the things I talked about that our plan emphasizes is more kind of on the regional or statewide picture. What I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes more is how we've been trying to engage more at the local level. And then collaboration and shared services is something we've really been trying to promote. And you will hear, I think, a lot of really good information about that on both with Randy Cole's remarks as well as the panel discussion. So this is a lot of you, if you've been involved with management or business, this is a pretty famous quote. People all have their own variation, I think, of what the quote is, but it's basically culture eats strategy for breakfast, tactics for lunch, and process for dinner. And I think that's really true. I think the culture that your organization has really, in the end, ends up driving a lot of what you end up doing. And the best laid plans, the best laid planning agencies, I think, can be undone or at least hamstrung by not trying to get culture right. So from our staff's perspective, we really try to focus pretty heavily on constantly reevaluating our culture and what are we doing well that we should continue to do, what can we improve, and I think there's always something that you can improve. Specifically with what we're learning, I think, is we're trying to be a government agency that I always joke that doesn't seem like a government agency. We at least like the public stereotype of what a government agency is. And what I mean by that is we try to be transparent, we try to be innovative and not risk averse, and we really try to do things more in a networked fashion. And that probably is easier for us just because when MPOs were created, we've been here since 1962. That was kind of the name of the game. That's why we exist. We're here to coordinate things. But I think you can do that better, or you can do that less well. Another thing, and I think this is common really in our disciplines that we work in planning and engineering especially, it's very easy to be reductive in your thinking. It's very easy to kind of look only at one part of the equation, and we've really tried to be a lot more holistic in how we look at things, not just trying to solve one specific problem, but in trying to solve a problem, saying what does that solution do to the rest of the system. And then the final thing, which should be obvious, but I think, again, it's something that can always be done better, is really to value people. Everything we do involves relationships with people. They're really what matters. And I think when you strip away all the details of what we do, in the end, our job is to help people, to help all of you, to help the residents of our area. And I like to say everything else is just paperwork, or at least electronic work and technical details. I think, too, just by the nature of the way that our agencies organize with our policy committee of local elected officials, as well as the work that we do with citizens, we're really learning that everyone is a valuable member of a network, whether they're an elected official, whether they're a non-elected public official, whether they're the private sector, or just everyday citizens. And I think learning how to leverage and make those networks work together better has been important, and really trying not to view that as anything mechanistic. The famous view that people will tend to take of viewing people as cogs in a machine. We do try to interact with everyone on a human level, and I think one of our big roles really is to be a catalyst, not necessarily to be in the end being the ones that are implementing a lot of plans or projects, but we're here to kind of facilitate and help with all that. I think another thing that we're learning is, organizations are very important, but organizations also are there to do things. And so, we really try to strive to see organizations as being a means to an end, but ideas are really what changes the world. And but of course, we really can't look at that in isolation either, because organizations tend to be where those ideas are developed, and if you just come up with ideas and you don't have any sort of human or institutional infrastructure to make those work. So I think we kind of have to think on two levels at once, not viewing organizations as an end, but as a means, but at the same time nurturing them, renewing them so that they can more effectively champion good ideas. So a couple ways that we are trying to transform. I've mentioned a couple times the think regionally, act locally concept. I'll talk in a little bit about our Bike-N-Brainstorm program, as well as connecting communities. And on one level, those are small things, but I think doing small things well is a really great way to build on improving bigger things. And I think, again, that's probably a theme that you'll hear on the panel discussion about shared services is, starting something small as a shared service might seem, fairly modest and unglamorous, but I think it is a way of learning to do more better. Another thing that, as we go through a lot of our planning work, we really try to reject false choices that are out there. And those are common, I think, in the planning discussion, or anytime you talk about regional planning, there is kind of a fundamental tension between the local and the regional. And I think, many times people will use that as a wedge to drive people apart. And we really try to be a place where we're treating everyone equally, where we're looking at things holistically. And I think rejecting those false choices is wise and serves the region pretty well. When it comes to looking at things like, different communities, place versus place, one thing that we really try to focus on instead in our planning work is really two things. Fiscal sustainability, so the wise use of taxpayer dollars for public infrastructure, for transportation, and secondly, community viability. What can we do to help create places that future generations will cherish, enjoy, and be willing to sustain? One other final thing I think on what we're trying to do culturally different is we're really focusing more on person-to-person engagement. We found social media has been a really great tool to do that, both to have substantive conversations with people using social media, but I think what we're finding more and more is it's not just sitting in front of a computer while the other person's on their smartphone talking to them. It may start that way, but social media has been a very good way for us to meet people, to network, and eventually to talk to those people in person. So I think sometimes a common misperception about social media is it's all people sitting on one end of a computer screen. I think we see it more as a catalyst for actually building face-to-face relationships. The final thing I had on culture was not being afraid to do small things well. And I talked a little bit about that before. There's a famous quote in planning from Daniel Burton that says, "Make no little plans." And while that's a good quote, and I believe in big plans too, I think many times in our profession, people are uncomfortable trying to do small things, and unless there's a very large, more grandiose project, it doesn't necessarily resonate with them as well. And I think that's unfortunate because our regional transportation plan, for example, as important as it is, it's still a very high-level kind of strategic document that covers 2 counties, and I think in order to really implement a lot of it, you have to be willing to do smaller things and to zoom in. I think the other thing that we found is doing small things, when they're done well, they tend to a lot more easily establish trust with people, inspire hope, and build relationships. And I think conversely, the risk you always run with doing something really big is if it's not done all that well, those things tend to breed cynicism or just, people get impatient. Why isn't this happening? As far as the planning initiatives that we did over the last year, I'm going to go through about 7 or 8 of those fairly quickly, just to give you a feel for what some of the work products and initiatives we've done. The first one I mentioned a couple times, Transportation Outlook. That's our regional transportation plan that looks out to the year 2035. That was approved back in May of 2013. It recommends around $4 billion worth of transportation improvements, so there's a lot in there. Again, I mentioned some of these earlier, but the strategic priorities in that plan are maintaining existing roadways, promoting alternatives to driving, investing in transportation safety, and encouraging more traditional urban design and placemaking. As far as specific projects, I think again, the maintaining existing roads and enhancing public transit, I already kind of talked about. We have been trying to promote bicycling a lot more as a means of transportation and not just recreation. I'll talk about that in a second. We have been working a lot more on pedestrian planning. I remember when I became the director in 2008, we were talking about doing better pedestrian planning, and we realized we didn't have any sort of inventory of where sidewalks even existed. And we thought, it's kind of a fundamental thing if you're going to look at people walking around. So right after that, we went out and digitized all the sidewalks in Summit and Portage County, and we have maps. And I think over time we've gotten better data even from all of you at the local level. And what that's enabled us to do is to look at where are there sidewalks, where aren't there sidewalks, and really zoom in on those areas where, for example, there might be bus stops but no sidewalks, or there's a commercial area without sidewalks. I think we're fully aware it's not fiscally feasible or even appropriate to build a sidewalk on every road in our area, but trying to find the low-hanging fruit and the ones where that does make sense has been important. The number one priority on the plan is the reconstruction of the main Broadway interchange in Akron and the elimination of the Wolf Ledges Grant Street interchange. I'm pleased to say that was funded, and I know the City of Akron and ODOT District 4 are working very hard right now on preliminary engineering and design work for that project. It's definitely a huge safety concern and has been for a long time. From our funding program perspective, I mentioned earlier the letters of intent are due October 18th. I think this is certainly one of the key things that AMATS does is the transfer of federal funds to local governments for infrastructure projects. In 2013, it was actually our record year for the amount of money that we expended on transportation improvements. We put about $27 million out to local governments. And I think every year we're learning how better to coordinate those improvements between ourselves, ODOT, and local governments. And I think ODOT and the local governments deserve a huge amount of credit. In the end, those are the entities that actually make these projects happen. We're a conduit and a catalyst, but a lot of the hard work is done right at that level. Some of the major projects, last year, you might remember if you were at our annual meeting, we had the panel discussion on what's going on in downtown Kent, and it was very gratifying that we were able to put funding into the Esplanade, which is the bike and pedestrian facility that connects Kent State University to downtown Kent. If you haven't been there yet, I definitely encourage you to go out there. Jim Bowling's here somewhere in the audience. I'm sure he'd be willing to give you a walking tour. As well as I mentioned, Fix It First, maintenance of existing roads has been a big priority. We funded 25 resurfacing projects over the last couple of years. So that was another thing that we're pretty proud of. Safety, I mentioned, is a priority. Crashes and injuries and fatalities were all down from 2011 to 2012. Sometimes it's hard to tell, are they down because people are driving less, or are they down because of safety improvements that are being made? I think it's fair to say it's probably a combination of both, but the safety improvements are certainly helping bring those rates down. Distracted driving, Curtis mentioned there's a distracted driving simulator outside, courtesy of ODOT District 4. I definitely encourage you, maybe after lunch, to go out and check it out. It simulates what it's like to be driving while intoxicated or while texting, which you should never do. And it is, I think, a good tool for public outreach to give people a feel of what that's like. We also started to look more, because we're trying to concentrate more on bike planning, analyzing bike crashes. And I've got one slide on that here in a second. As far as traffic crashes, I won't go into detail on this, but again, they are down a little bit. We continue to identify trends as far as when and where those crashes occur. With vehicle crashes, the majority of them are fender benders or more minor crashes, but the ones that we're really trying to prevent are the serious injuries and fatalities. And those do tend to be fairly intractable problems. A lot of those still involve alcohol. A lot of those happen late at night. A lot of the fatal crashes actually are single vehicle, someone that's intoxicated after 2 a.m. So that's, I think, something that, the work against drunk driving continues to be very important there. Bike crashes, we're going to have a memo for the policy committee in December on that. We really started to take a close look at that for the first time just a couple months ago. With the bike crashes, there aren't nearly as many of them as the motor vehicle crashes, but as you can imagine, with a bike crash, it's going to be a lot more likely to result in an injury. So 78% of those crashes result in one. One interesting thing that we're finding is many people think that riding on the sidewalk is safer. It's really not. I don't have data exactly on how much less safe it is than riding on the road because we don't really have how many, good traffic counts on how many cyclists are out there on the road versus the sidewalk. But a lot of these crashes actually were people on the sidewalk because what tends to happen is, at driveways and other conflict points, they don't see the cyclist. A decent trend that we found too that was interesting is that when an officer cites who's at fault in a crash involving a motor vehicle and a cyclist, it's very closely correlated with age. So for people under 25 and especially under 16, the crashes tend to be the fault of the cyclist. As you get up over 25, which is very similar to auto insurance, they tend to be the fault of the driver. So that was kind of interesting. And then again, some of the pedestrian planning work that we've been doing, these even more, 86% of these crashes involved an injury. And one of the things we've been partnering with and providing some funding for is the Safe Routes to School program in conjunction with ODOT and with local governments. One shared service I just wanted to highlight this morning was our pavement condition rating shared service project. AMATS took the lead starting about a year ago, working with our subcommittee for the Transportation Improvement Program as a way of trying to see can we get economies of scale by pooling resources from local governments and from ourselves to analyze pavement conditions. This is something just about every community does anyway, and we thought if we can find a way of collectively doing that and funding it, we've estimated based on estimates from consultants, we can probably save 30 to 50% overall on data collection costs by doing it this way. Obviously, having a better set of data for pavement conditions will lead to better, better decisions on which roads to resurface first. And what we have an option with this program to add on for all local streets in a community, if your community chooses to, collecting data for even for every residential street. So it's been a great project. It's still kind of getting underway. Summit County agreed to be the fiscal agent for the project, so it really has been a true collaboration. The Bike-N-Brainstorms, I mentioned doing small things. So what the Bike-N-Brainstorms are is, we were talking about doing better bike planning about a year and a half ago, and one of the things that we realized is there's a limit to maybe how well we can understand what cyclists go through from the 8th floor of the city center building in downtown Akron, even with all the the maps and the air photos and everything that we have. So what we started doing basically are public meetings where we as a staff go out, we bike with residents, we bike with local officials in the community. We just had our 5th Bike-N-Brainstorm in Barberton back in September. We got 70 people, which I thought was really pretty fantastic for a public meeting. I think all of you know you usually don't see 70 people unless they don't like something that you're doing. And I mean, this was the opposite. You obviously have to have traditional public meetings too, but this was really fun. Mayor Judge was there and rode with us. The Barberton Police Department kind of led the ride, and it was great. We had a couple break points where we talked at each part, and that's where the brainstorming part comes in. What can be done to make this road safer for cyclists? One of the projects in Barberton right now is to build a bridge over the Tuscarawas River to connect the downtown to the towpath. So we spent a lot of time in that area looking at that too. So they really have been a great way to, I think, build goodwill between public officials and members of the public. And I think that it will actually lead to tangible improvements as well. One other small but I think important thing that we've embarked on is our Connecting Communities Planning Grant. I know a lot of you are familiar with that program. This was our third round of Connecting Communities Planning Grants. This year they were awarded to Copley and Bath Townships for the Montrose area, as well as for Barberton for the project that I mentioned earlier. One thing that we tried to do, and it relates to what I said earlier about learning by doing, is we had the folks from Barberton and from Montrose come to the city of Kent, and Jim Bowling and Brian Smith took everybody on a really nice walking tour of a lot of the work that's gone on there. And while at first glance you might say, well, Montrose isn't Kent, or Barberton isn't Montrose, or isn't Kent, there are a lot of ways I think that learning what was done there can help, and I think it's just another way of kind of sharing information between local officials. It's been very helpful. With the Montrose project, that just got underway. One of the things that we did is put out a survey for residents. Basically, there's 4 things that this project focused on: improving bike and pedestrian and transit infrastructure, internal circulation of traffic, and wayfinding. If you've been to that area, a lot of times you'll know that the store is on Market Street, but that's a pretty big area. It could be nestled back in one of many different developments. So that's one thing that we'll be focusing on. Could there be better signage to help vehicles find their way to these businesses? Aesthetics and urban design. Montrose has been a very successful area commercially, but we know from the history of commercial developments all over our region, there are places that were the place to be 30 years ago that no longer are. So this is going to focus very heavily too on what can we do to make this area look and feel better. We created a survey for residents. The Beacon Journal wrote a nice article on it. We got, I think, just about 600 responses so far from the public, and basically, I think if I had to summarize, the 2 trends were: we really think that Montrose should be a place you can walk around and should look better, and secondly, we don't believe that that's ever going to happen. So I kind of looked at that. I like to look at the first one more, but I think the residents are right. It's, practically speaking, it's not going to be an area that you can turn into a quaint town, and you could argue, maybe nor should you, but I think there are a lot of small things that can be done there to improve, and it does have real traffic ramifications, because I think vehicles, many times people will even drive to the store that's 100 yards away. It'll involve them pulling back out onto a road and then parking again. So just to kind of illustrate the kind of small things we're looking at and the low-hanging fruit, at least at this point, this is Route 18 in Bath Township, pretty major road. You can see there are no sidewalks on it. And there are, Rich Eddy from Metro, I know, could tell you there are a lot of people that take the bus that work at Montrose that it's not just for them, it's not an option of whether it's a walkable place or not. They are walking. They're just walking, usually under pretty terrible conditions. This is just another example of something that can probably be improved. This is a transit stop. You can see obviously people are using this transit stop based on all the grass that's worn away. Again, there aren't any sidewalks. Up ahead at Barnes & Noble on Route 18, there's not any crosswalk there. Obviously on Route 18 you can't put crosswalks all over the road. It's too busy, but right now there are really no viable ways to get across that road on foot. And then this is a picture of a bike rack in Montrose, which is actually a guardrail. So just following up on what I said about social media, we've been active on Twitter. We have 148 followers. We've been putting videos out on YouTube more and more often, everything from kind of public service announcements to documenting some of the work that we've done. Carrie is back there actually recording this right now, so this will end up out on YouTube. And we found it's a great way to interact with the public and let them know more what the agency is doing. Kind of wrapping things up, just a couple other things that we've been up to this year. Strategic partnerships. We've worked very closely with Summit County on the Code for America project, which is working at creating apps basically for smartphones and a website for giving residents more information about how to access trails both bike trails and walking trails in the region. We've been working with the City of Akron and the University of Akron on the How We Roll program, which is basically a bike planning initiative. I mentioned earlier the Safe Routes to School program in Akron. They're doing a district-wide plan to help kids walk to school more safely. And finally, there's a table in the back of the Northeast Ohio Sustainable Communities Consortium. That's something I think a lot of you that have been to our meetings have heard me talk about before. That's a 12-county regional planning effort that's going on right now. I think there will be a presentation from NEOSCC at our December policy committee meeting to give you a little bit more information on where that is. So in closing, thank you so much for coming out this morning. We really love putting this event on. We couldn't do this without you. I wanted to give a special thanks to my staff for the great work that they've done. And to all of you as public officials, I know the work that you do is far too often unsung by lots of people. So thank you to you and also to the citizens of our region. I mean, one of the things that we've really found is in working with people, getting to know the public, it really has helped us, I think, do our job better. And there are a lot of good ideas out there that citizens have. We love our jobs. I love my job. I feel very blessed to be doing this. And if I would leave you with anything, I would say, one of the things that we've really tried to focus on with a lot of the culture change stuff I was talking about is it starts with curiosity. It starts with asking why to problems. I think that leads to asking what, which leads to knowledge, and then asking how to do something, which I think is where wisdom comes in. I love quotes. Two of my favorite quotes. C.S. Lewis, although he wasn't an urban planner, I think it's very applicable. The future is something which everyone reaches at the rate of 60 minutes an hour, whatever he does, whoever he is. And I think that's very true because one of the things that's easy to fall into in planning is thinking about the future is enough. And I think the future is somewhere we all get to, hopefully we all get to, whether we want to or not, all at the same rate. It's what you do with that time and how you plan for that really makes a difference. And then the thing I mentioned earlier about false choices, I think, in everything we do, we're trying to find the middle way. And to find the middle way will require all our intelligence and our goodwill. So with that, thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to maybe take one or two, and then we'll move on to the next speaker, Randy Cole, and I'll give him an introduction in a minute. Thanks so much for coming out.